Adjunct Professor Moran, Microeconomics 112. We continue to discuss types of business competition, and we're focusing in these sessions on oligopoly. Oligopoly is when there are few producers. That creates conditions of mutual independence where what one person does will be influenced by the options their competitor has. Now, behavioral economics, so we're going to focus on game theory. And game theory is part of behavioral economics. Behavioral economics is the introduction of psychology into economics. This was not part of economics when I went to college in the 70s. I've checked both my intro and intermediate course textbooks, and this was not a topic. So this is a developing field. The assumptions of classical economics are good, but not completely realistic. And so behavioral economics is exploring those conditions, those assumptions, and seeing what real-world applications come out of it. So let's discuss some of these. People are solitary decision makers. Well, that's not true. You're influenced by your friends and advertising. How people form preferences doesn't matter. Yes, it does, because corporations can influence how you make your preferences. People have the same preferences. That's not true. People are different, have different preferences. When we studied consumer behavior and utility maximization, we assumed that you knew what your preferences were and how much you usually got out of each purchase. And those vary from consumer to consumer. People have perfect knowledge. Well, that's certainly not true. People need to be informed of the attributes of a product and make informed decisions. And so advertising is a key part of economics. People have unbounded computational capabilities. Well, that's not true, because it's hard to know what your preferences are. It can be easy to mislead people or confuse them when it comes to making their choices. People have willpower. Sometimes people make impulsive decisions that are not in their own self-best interest. People are capable of acting upon their preferences. Well, it may be hard for people to know their preferences. So, given these cracks in the assumptions of classical economics, a school of economics has developed behavioral economics, and you can actually make people do things that are not in their own self-interest. I remember when I took economics in college, they argued you could not create a want from advertising, and these people say you can. And there's impulse buying as well, things like that. So you can make a living with behavioral economics. It's possible that this can be applied to mergers and acquisitions. Game theory. Let's focus on game theory now. That if we make this offer, what are they going to do? Because mutual independence, only a few players. It's important to have strategic thinking. Pricing the product. For only two players, we price it at this point. What are they going to do? Advertising. Car sales on a more personal basis. If we make this offer, what is the consumer's reaction going to be? Auctions in general, which is what mergers and acquisitions are, pricing. So there are applications of this. I have not taken a full course on this, but if I were in college today, I would take a course on behavioral economics and game theory, certainly. Strategic thinking is the art of outdoing your adversary, knowing that he's doing the same thing to you. Game theory is used to explain how two or more players make decisions or choose actions when their actions affect each participant, which has to happen only when there are few participants, as in the case of oligopoly, not in the case of pure competition or monopolist competition when there are many competitors. Each player determines his or best response to the possible actions of the other player. According to game theory, a player's best strategy depends on the strategy the player thinks the other player will choose. So again, here, as we did in the last video, what you want to do is, if you're one competitor, you want to say, well, if this guy does this, what should I do? But if he does his other choice, what should I do? and that will lead to a dominant theory in some situations. When the chosen strategies reinforce each other, it results in a Nash equilibrium. A Nash equilibrium is named after the guy who figured it out and is subject of the movie A Beautiful Mind. Yes, finally an economist gets to be the hero of a movie, and spoiler alert, he's crazy. But he does win the Nobel Prize for this work. Game theory provides insights into how businesses and government decisions are made and has numerous real-world applications. For example, game theory has helped economists analyze antitrust policy, tariff wars, and auctioning behavior. This lesson will introduce the basic elements of game theory. As you do the math, think about the implications of game. Yeah, it's difficult for an intro student to see the applications of game theory. But they are there, and so it's been included in the curriculum. Okay, the basic elements of game theory. Okay, you have two players in a basic introduction. And there are courses on this where it gets very complex. The strategies available to each player. So usually we have two players, and each player has two choices. That gives you a matrix, this is called a payoff matrix of 4. Two players with two choices, payoff matrix of 4. The first number of each squares, so it's row, then column. So it's Pepsi and Coke. Pepsi, Coke, Pepsi, Coke, Pepsi, Coke, Pepsi, Coke. The choice here is they're trying to decide, each company's trying to decide whether they should advertise or not advertise. So, if Pepsi advertises and Coke advertises, Pepsi gets 80. If Pepsi advertises and Coke does not advertise, Pepsi gets 120. If Pepsi doesn't advertise and Coke advertises, Pepsi only gets 45. If Pepsi doesn't advertise and Coke doesn't advertise, Pepsi gets 100. On the other hand, notice that Pepsi was always first. If Coke decides to advertise and Pepsi decides to advertise, Coke gets 80. If Coke advertises and Pepsi doesn't advertise, Coke gets 120. Coke doesn't advertise, Pepsi advertises, Coke gets 45, the second choice. If Coke doesn't advertise and Pepsi doesn't advertise, Coke gets 100. Okay, a dominant strategy is the best. Definitions. A dominant strategy is the best strategy for one player regardless of what the other player does. In this game, Pepsi and Coke, the dominant strategy will be choose to advertise. That's because whatever happens, if Pepsi advertises, their payoff is better than when they don't advertise. 80, 45, 120, 100. A dominated strategy is one that yields a lower payoff than at least one other strategy. In this case, the dominated strategy for Pepsi is not advertise, because it always works out better for them, regardless of what Coke does advertise. A Nash equilibrium is a combination of strategies for each player such that each chooses his or her best strategy. In this game, the Nash equilibrium is Coke choosing advertise and Pepsi choosing advertise. Although in this example they both have the same strategy, this does not necessarily have to be so. So Pepsi's better at advertising, or else Coke does. And the same is true for Coke. They're better off advertising regardless of what Pepsi does. So the Nash equilibrium will in this box. But if you take a higher level course on game theory, that does not necessarily have to be the case. Okay, so what you want to do in these situations, in problems like this, is what should Pepsi do? Let's explore that. So Pepsi is thinking, what should we do if Coke advertises or doesn't advertise? So Pepsi wants to do, if Coke has two choices. If Coke advertises, what should we do? And if Coke doesn't what should we do? Well, Coke only has two choices: advertise or not advertise. If Coke advertises, Coke advertising. If Pepsi advertises, Pepsi makes 80. If Pepsi doesn't advertise, when Coke advertises, Pepsi only makes 45. So if Coke advertises, Pepsi's better off advertising. If Coke doesn't advertise, Pepsi's thinking to itself, well, if Pepsi advertises, Pepsi gets 120. If Pepsi doesn't advertise and Coke doesn't advertise, Pepsi only gets 100. Pepsi's definitely better off advertising, regardless of what Coke does. That means that Pepsi's dominant strategy is advertising, and Pepsi's dominated strategy is not advertising. Coke is doing the same thing. So they're thinking, what are our opponent's choices? And the two choices for Pepsi are to advertise or not advertise. So what's Coke's responses? This would be Coke's response. To either advertise or not advertise. So Coke's thinking to itself, if our opponent advertises, what should we do? So if Pepsi advertises, and then Coke's response is to advertise, Coke can get 80. But if Pepsi advertises and Coke doesn't advertise, Coke only gets 45. So if Pepsi advertises, Coke should also advertise. Now, what should Coke do if Pepsi doesn't advertise? Well, if Pepsi doesn't advertise and Coke advertises, Coke gets 120. If Pepsi doesn't advertise and Coke doesn't advertise, Coke gets 100. So in this situation also, Coke's dominant strategy is to advertise, because regardless of what its opponent does, it receives a better result by advertising. That's the dominated strategy. The dominated strategy is the not advertising situation. Since both of the dominated strategies put them in the advertise box, this is a Nash equilibrium. They're both better off they advertise, and that's a stable equilibrium. No reason to change. Let's do an example together called the prisoner's dilemma. A classic example in this field of game theory. All right, the prisoner's dilemma. Prisoner's dilemma games are games in which each player has a dominant strategy, and when both players play the dominant strategy, the payoffs are smaller than if each player played the dominated strategy. The dilemma is how to avoid this bad income. Okay, one thing we didn't discuss was, notice that if we add up what's good for society, and we consider only Coke and Pepsi to be the society, this is 160. This is 200. They'd actually be better off if they both didn't advertise. But if they work out an illegal agreement not to compete, not to advertise, they'll both be better off. But as soon as they sign the agreement, this agreement is not enforceable. It's against the law for competitors to agree not to compete in this country. As soon as they agree not to compete, Pepsi's going to go back and say, well, we know that Coke isn't advertising. Should we advertise or not advertise? And they'll discover that they're better off advertising. So they'll cheat and go, ha ha ha, we're going to cheat Coke and go advertise. And we'll get 120, and they'll be stuck not advertising in 40. Coke's doing the same thing, and they're thinking, like, when they get back to Atlanta Joyce, well, we just got Pepsi to agree not to advertise. If Pepsi doesn't advertise and we do advertise, then we'll get 120. So these collusive agreements, a collusive agreement is an illegal agreement not to compete, they break down, and the expression is there's no honor among thieves, and so they'll end up at the SNES Nash equilibrium where they're both advertising, which results in a less of a payout for the overall society of 160 compared to 200. That's going to happen here as well in this example of the prisoner's dilemma. When both players play the dominant strategy, the payoffs are smaller than if each player played the dominant strategy. Again, the dominated strategy for Coke and Pepsi would be not advertised and they'd get 200 as a society, 100 each. But because they're going to cheat, they'll end up with a dominated strategy where they end up with 80 each, a total for society of 160. The basics of the prisoner's dilemma are as follows. There are two prisoners and have the option to confess or not to confess to a crime they committed. The prosecution only has enough information to convict both criminals of a minor offense, and it is therefore trying to get a confession. The minor offense carries 1 year in jail. The prisoners are questioned in different cells without the ability to communicate. They are told that if one prisoner confesses and the other prisoner remains silent, the confessing person will go free. The silent and the remaining prisoner will get 20 years. If both prisoners confess, they'll both serve 3 years in jail. If a player goes free, the payoff is 0. 1 year in jail is -1. 20 years is -20. What we want to do is we want to create our playoff matrix. 3 elements of the game. That's going to be prisoner 1 and prisoner 2. The strategies are confess or not confess. And the payoffs are 0, -1, -3, and -20. And we'll demonstrate that as we complete the payoff matrix. So this is prisoner 2, this is prisoner 1. The choices are confess and not confess. If they both confess, they'll each do 3 years. If both prisoners confess, they do 3 years in jail. Okay. If neither confesses, they each do a year in jail. Payoff is society. -6, -1. This is definitely better for society. The minor offense carries 1 year in jail. Right, we got that one. Okay. One person goes free and the other serves 20 in jail. Here's our payoff matrix. Prisoner 1 confesses, prisoner 2 confesses, they each do 3 years. Total 6 years in jail. If prisoner 1 confesses, he gets no time in jail if the other guy hangs tight with his buddy. Because his buddy cheats him, he goes to jail for 20 years. Similarly, if this guy tries to hang tight with his buddy, but his buddy confesses, this guy goes to jail for 20 years and this guy goes free. For society, a -20, the worst outcome possible. If neither person confesses, they only do a year each, and as a total, they do only 2 years in jail. The best outcome for society, but why won't that prevail? Okay. What's the dominant strategy? To confess. So let's think about what prisoner 1's thinking about. He's thinking about what prisoner 2 might do. If prisoner 2 confesses or doesn't confess, Prisoner 2 has two options: either confess or not confess. If prisoner 2 confesses, then the choice for prisoner 1 is to confess or not confess. So if prisoner 2 confesses, the outcome is -3 or -20. So this is the choice prisoner 1 should do if prisoner 2 is going to confess. Prisoner 2 confessing, prisoner 1 the first choice. Now, if prisoner 2 doesn't confess, prisoner 1 thinking, what should I do? So if prisoner 2 confesses and prisoner 1 doesn't confess, he goes free. And if prisoner 2 doesn't confess and prisoner 1 confesses, he goes to jail for a year. In this situation, this is the dominant strategy for prisoner 2, for prisoner 1. So prisoner 1 should definitely confess, because no matter what prisoner 2 does, it's the better outcome for him. That's his dominated strategy. It's the same thing for prisoner 2. So you can complete that and see that for yourself. As a result, even though this is the best outcome for society, they're going to end up in this box. Because this guy, as soon as he realizes his friend is not going to confess, they agree not to confess. So they have in a room on their own. This guy's going to go, well, wait, I can go free? I'm going for free. Prisoner 1 confesses, prisoner 2 doesn't confess. This guy's going to do the same thing. If I confess and the other guy doesn't confess, I go free. So they're both going to try to cheat their friend, and they're going to end up over here where the outcome is worse for society. The dominant strategy is confess. The dominated strategy is not confessing. The Nash equilibrium is confessing, even though it's not the best for society. Okay. That's our discussion of game theory, a component of a new school of economics called behavioral economics. So these collusions, these attempts to get into this box, which is best for society, called collusion, is the incentive to negotiate with competitors to set quantity and price, for example. There are formal agreements. So Kohler and American Standard, manufacturers of bathroom agreements, flew into a city and agreed not to compete. They were either setting their agreements to not compete on region or sell our basic products at one price and our premium products at the same price, and they weren't competing. But they'll cheat. They'll move away from this agreement, which is best for society, and each one will try to cheat the other, putting them in this Nash equilibrium. There are informal agreements not to compete as well. But there's an incentive to cheat, and can, as a result, lead to price wars. If this were pricing, they said, let's just charge a higher price. And then they'd realize that by charging a lower price, they'll steal market share from the other guy. And that'll put them in this box where they don't get an overall as good result as they would if they agreed to stuck to their agreement. But each one will try to cheat because you can't enforce illegal agreements in the court. Okay. And that is our discussion on types of business competition, ending with oligopoly and a focus on game theory.